Welcome back to the Moderate Fundamentalists YouTube channel. Thanks very much for subscribing. And in today's reading, I'll read an excerpt from chapter 1. And this will be the first 8 pages of the book. And this will be a long-winded explanation of why I wrote the book. I grew up calling two men my father. In the West, where many people have a biological father and a stepfather, this is not as unusual as it was in Pakistan, where I grew up. I did not meet my biological father, Maulana Ahl-e-Hadith al-Shaheed, and if you go to the book resources, you see his picture here on the left, until I was 7 years old. The only contact with my father during my early childhood was his weekly letters and the occasional black and white photograph that he mailed us from West Africa, where he was working as a missionary. My mother says that my primary motivation for learning to read was to be able to read Abhi Jan's Urdu for father letters on my own instead of having to beg her to read them to me. The older man in whose house we lived, and whom I called Abbaji, also meaning father in Urdu, was actually my maternal grandfather. And you see his picture on the right. This is the moderatefundamentalist.com website that I introduced in the last video. I called him Abbaji because my mother called him Abbaji. I also called my maternal grandmother Ammiji, Urdu for mother, following my mother, whom I called Ammi Jan, also meaning mother. Rather than correcting me, my grandparents took pleasure in my childish behavior, perhaps because they didn't have a son of their own. In the fiercely patriarchal Pakistani culture, not having a son is almost as bad as being childless. Abbaji, my grandfather, had been a proud man in his youth. He was the first one in his village to go to college and the first one in his family to learn English. He graduated as an overseer from an engineering college and worked as a public servant, first for the government of British India and then Pakistan. An estimated 12 million Hindus and Muslims died during the ethnic cleansing that followed the partition of the Indian subcontinent into India and Pakistan in 1947. My grandfather, who was born and bred in East Punjab, followed most Eastern Punjabi Muslims in abandoning his ancestral home for Western Punjab, which became part of Pakistan. He avoided the fate of 6 million Indian Muslims who were killed by Hindus and Sikh mobs during their ill-fated journeys to Pakistan, in part because he was member of the well-organized Ahmadiyya Muslim community. Caravans of Ahmadi trucks moved together, sometimes under police protection, carrying thousands of Ahmadis from their headquarters in the East Punjabi village of Qadian to the West Punjabi city of Lahore, which became part of Pakistan. Once in Pakistan, the Indian refugees were offered a chance to claim properties in Pakistan abandoned by Hindus and Sikhs in lieu of the properties that they had left behind in India. The head of the Ahmadiyya community, known as the Khalifa, Arabic for Caliph, Allah's infallible viceroy on earth, advised Ahmadis against abandoning their Indian properties because Allah would soon victoriously return Ahmadis to Qadian, the small village where their faith had been born a bare half-century earlier in 1889. This meant that Abbaji and thousands of other pious Ahmadis started their lives from scratch in the new country. Abbaji did well enough to buy a house in the city of Gojra, where he raised his 3 daughters. When the Khalifa, whom Ahmadis affectionately call Hazur, meaning honorable, founded the new Ahmadiyya headquarters on the barren western shores of Chenab River in the early 1950s. Abbaji bought a tract of land there as his future retirement home. The modest home that he built in Rabwa came in handy when he decided to arrange for his middle daughter to marry an Ahmadiyya missionary school called Jamia Ahmadiyya student in 1967. Couldn't afford a home of his own. Abhi Jan, my biological father, stood out among the Jamia students for a number of reasons, not the least of which was his age. In the mid-20s, he was almost a decade older than some of his youngest class fellows. In order to become a Jamia student, one had to take a vow to offer all of one's capacities in the services of Huzur without ever asking for anything in return. For a typical Jamia student, this was often done by the parents writing to Huzur to seek his permission to offer their children to God. These students would then enter Jamia as soon as they finished their middle school. In order to induce their sons to keep their word to Huzur, the parents would often promise to pay them a stipend for the rest of their lives. My paternal grandparents, who formed in a small village in Sialkot, Pakistan, did not offer any of their 6 sons to the movement. Instead, they supported their second oldest son's decision to become the first person in the village to go to college and study sciences. After graduating with a degree in physics and mathematics, Abbijan took up a government job as a high school science teacher. It was after a few years of teaching that he received his calling from God and offered himself to the head of the community. Because Abbijan essentially neither had any income of his own as a Jamia student, nor a parental stipend, my mother had to work outside the house to support the family, an indignity for a middle-class Pakistani woman. This meant that as the movement sent my father from one town to another, following his graduation in 1970, my mother had to stay behind at her parents' house and close to her job. Thus, when I was born, it was Abbaji who wrote the letter to Huzur, customarily written by the father of the newborn, requesting him to bless the newborn with a name, Huzur, perhaps thinking that the author of the letter, that is, my Abbaji, named Muhammad Sharif, was requesting a name for his own son, gave to me my grandfather and Prophet Muhammad's first name and wrote with his own hands, Muhammad Afzal, congratulations. So that's the postcard that you see here in the resources for chapter. So he wrote Muhammad Afzal, congratulations on Abbaji's postcard. More than 46 years, 47 now, that have passed, but that postcard is one of my mother's most prized possessions. Not just because it's the first time that my name was written, but also because it once touched the hands of Huzur. So you see a picture of the third caliph at the bottom here, the person who wrote the name. Because it's the first time that it once touched the hands of Huzur. Afzal can be either a comparative or a superlative term in Arabic, meaning better or best, depending on the context. Just as no English-speaking parents would name their child better or best, Arabic speakers do not name their children Afzal. By the time I was born, the persistent efforts of Ahmadi pioneers had managed to turn the inhospitable, saline and rocky soils of Rabwa into the first planned city of Pakistan, fulfilling the divine dream of Rabwa's founder, the second Ahmadi Khalifa. And you see his picture here. The second Ahmadi Khalifa, son of the founder of Ahmadiyya community. And here's a picture of the founder of the Ahmadiyya community, who reigned from 1914 to 1966. The city of 40,000, entirely populated by Ahmadis, served as the headquarters of the million-strong, worldwide Ahmadiyya Muslim community, unlike Qadian, where Ahmadis had to cohabit a large number of Hindus and Sikhs. Rabwa was a city built from scratch by Ahmadis for Ahmadis. The Ahmadi officials, all personally appointed by Huzur, not only served as spiritual guides but also as city's civil administration. Rabwa was divided into about 30 precincts, with a mosque serving as the focal point for each precinct. The community enforced complete gender segregation, with separate schools and colleges for men and women. Women had to cover themselves from head to toe in a black burqa, with only their eyes showing when they had to leave their houses. The city had no cinemas, because even Pakistani films promoted immorality by showing unveiled women. Anyone caught visiting cinemas in the neighboring city of Chennai, or caught violating any of the other numerous bans, such as the ban against flying kites, the ban against males clapping publicly, the ban against celebrating birthdays, the ban against associating with non-Ahmadis, for example by taking part in their weddings or their funerals, etc., was punished by excommunicating or expulsion from Rabwa. To encourage people to attend the daily Islamic ritual prayer of Fajr offered at pre-dawn hours, groups of boys and young men went around shouting, "Prayer is better than sleep," at pre-dawn hours in the streets of Rabwa. We, the residents of Rabwa, took great pride in our status as the most organized and the most disciplined of all Muslims, who were ready to sacrifice our lives to ensure the fulfillment of God's astrological plans of making Islam the dominant religion before the end of the world. At our weekly boys' association meetings, and later, when I grew up, at men's association meetings, we eagerly chanted our pledge to sacrifice my wealth, my life, my time, and honor for the sake of our faith, and for guarding the institution of Ahmadiyya Caliphate. While the community sent my father into various parts of Pakistan and to other countries, we lived with my mother and maternal grandparents in Rabwa, where my mother taught at a girls' primary school. My father's first missionary appointments were in various Pakistani cities, so he must have seen me on one of his visits home, but I have no memory of that. When I became old enough to remember faces, he was working in the West African nation of Ghana, where Jamaat had sent him in 1973. I learned of my father's face from the few black and white photographs that he had mailed us from Africa. These pictures looked eerily similar to the author's picture on the back cover of the well-known Ahmadi Urdu book On the Shroud of Turin. In his book, Hassan Muhammad Khan Sahib, you see his picture here, a local celebrity, defended the radical Ahmadiyya doctrinal position on Jesus' crucifixion. Imagine my surprise when I finally saw my father for the first time at the age of 7, and he didn't look anything like Hassan Muhammad Khan Sahib. My father stayed with us in Rabwa for about 6 months before being sent to Mirpur Khas in Sindh province of Pakistan. The few times that I got to see my father between his various missionary appointments, I never heard him complain about having to sacrifice his family life. In fact, I heard countless times from him and from other Ahmadis that sacrifices for the community were the real cause of any success, however small, that our family had had. My good health, my good grades in school, and my success in constantly ongoing religious competitions in Rabwa were all direct results of my father's missionary vows. And you see some of the certificates that I got by taking part in the religious competitions here on the resources by chapter 1 page. The early 1970s were a heady time for Ahmadis in Pakistan. Ahmadis believed that they had played a decisive role in the victory of the Socialist Pakistan People's Party in Pakistan's first elections based on universal suffrage held in December 1970. They believed that the PPP would pay them back for their support by allowing them to preach unmolested, which in their minds could only lead to one outcome, namely a quick acceptance of Ahmadiyyat, Arabic for Ahmadism, as true Islam, first by all Pakistanis and then by the rest of the world. This elation turned into a deep sense of betrayal when, in 1974, Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto capitulated to the Sunni mullahs, demanding a constitutional amendment to declare Ahmadis non-Muslims. When Bhutto was hanged by the military in 1979, the atmosphere at the annual Ahmadiyya convention that brought hundreds of thousands of Ahmadis from across the globe into Rabwa every year for a long weekend in December was openly celebratory. There was a strong sense that prophecies predicting destruction of any worldly power that took on God's chosen people had been fulfilled in front of our eyes. With the centennial of the community's founding only a decade away, we were eagerly anticipating people joining Ahmadiyyat in droves. I remember frequently running into the community's official historian, Maulana Dost Muhammad Shahid Sahib, who worked at Khilafat Library 2 blocks from our new house in the Foreign Missionaries' Quarters, where we moved in 1983. Every time I saw him, he would ask me, what would my age be in the year 2000, when people around the world would be flocking to Ahmadiyyat? Will I be ready to accept the hordes of non-Ahmadis desperately looking for anyone knowledgeable enough about Ahmadiyya to save their souls? The fact that the world was going to be saved through Ahmadiyya was not in any doubt. What was doubtful was whether we, as individuals, were willing to play our role and gain salvation for ourselves. At the daily religious lectures that were delivered following the evening prayers at our neighboring mosque, at our weekly Atfal, that is Young Ahmadi Boys Association meetings, at the yearly Quranic education classes, and at the annual Ahmadiyya conventions, we were routinely told about the success that Ahmadi missionaries, such as my father, Abhijan, were having in converting non-Ahmadis to Ahmadiyyat around the world. This success proved that God was on our side. While both my dads were proudly faithful Ahmadis, their faith styles differed from each other. Abhijan, my father, had the cerebral faith of a born-again scholar, having heard God's calling after studying and teaching science for years. My father had spent 7 years in Jamia Ahmadiyya Missionary School learning the minutiae of theological arguments. He had traveled around the world, engaging people of all faiths in religious debates. This set him apart from most other Ahmadis, such as my Abbaji, who hadn't read all the books of Hadith or Ahmadiyya doctrine or traveled widely, but had a strong emotional attachment to the Jamaat and a firm belief in the supernatural. This included a belief in the miraculous powers of the Khalifa and an irrational reverence for anyone, such as the family of the founder of the Ahmadiyya Jamaat or anything connected to the founder of the Ahmadiyya Jamaat. My grandfather would get extremely upset if he ever heard anyone say anything that he perceived as insulting towards a member of Khandan, the hundreds-strong progeny of the founder of the Ahmadiyya movement who lived in a gated area in central Rabwa. Similar to most devoted Ahmadis, my grandfather endeavored to give ever more of his meager resources to the community, not content with contributing the obligatory 1/16 of his modest income of his government pension to the movement. Abbaji wrote to Hazur to grant him permission to donate 1/8. Once he was allowed to do that, he wrote another letter asking for permission to contribute 1/4 of his income. Once that request was granted, he asked the proportion to be increased to 1/3. Hazur, to his credit, denied that request. Abbaji refused to take no for an answer and kept writing. Well, to be more accurate, he kept asking me to write because by this time he was too old to write himself, until he had his way. Had he lived longer, I'm sure he would have requested permission to donate half of his income, and actually all of it, and eventually all of it. In 1979, when the third Ahmadi Khalifa, grandson of the founder of the movement, who reigned from 1966 to 1982, launched a decade-long campaign to raise funds to celebrate the centennial of the founding of the Ahmadiyya movement in 1889, Abbaji sold his house in Gojra and donated the entire proceeds to the Ahmadiyya Centennial Fund. I don't think I ever saw him happier than he was on the day that he received an invitation to a private meeting of major donors with Hazur. He had my mom put starch on his shalwar kameez, long shirt and tunic, and his white turban that he proudly wore to the meeting with Hazur, his face beaming with happiness at the prospect of being able to spend time in the physical presence of God's infallible regent on earth. While I barely knew my absent father, my grandfather was my role model. Like him, I would get up well before sunrise to offer the optional tahajjud prayer. I prayed for Allah to make me success both in the secular and in the spiritual world. Like my Abbaji, I wanted to be ready to play my part in God's plan for the end times. During the Jalsa, when we had a house full of relatives from across Pakistan, I led everyone in the ritual prayers, just as Abbaji often did at our neighborhood mosque. I read the Quran, first in Arabic and then in translation in Urdu, first from Abbaji and then from Maulana Zakariya Khan Sahib, the community's official Albanian language translator. I read the books by the founder of the community and his successors, that is, the Khalifas. I eagerly enrolled in the annual Talimul Quran education classes, and I took part in the competitions of religious knowledge, rhetoric, and Arabic recitation. Above all, as did my Abbaji, I internalized being a good believer as a critical part of my identity. I still remember some of the verses of my favorite childhood poems that I used to sing to anyone who would listen. हम अहमदी बच्चे हैं, कुछ करके दिखा देंगे, शैतान की हुकूमत को दुनिया से मिटा देंगे, ऐ शाद गुमा मत कर, कमज़ोर नहीं हैं हम, जब वक्त पड़ा हम अपनी जानें भी कमा देंगे. हम अहमदी बच्चे हैं, कुछ करके दिखा देंगे, इस्लाम को दुनिया में महबूब बना देंगे. So translation is, we are Ahmadi kids, we'll do something big. We'll abolish Satan's government from the earth. Don't worry for us, we're not weak. When the time comes, we'll even sacrifice our lives. We're Ahmadi kids, we'll do something big. We'll make Islam everyone's beloved religion. I think I was 7 when I had memorized the entire poem, and I sang it for a delighted Abbaji who kissed me on the forehead. He had the face of a revolutionary, filled with the satisfaction of having passed his revolution to his son. I always sided with my grandfather when on occasion his strict interpretations of Islam contradicted with what seemed to me back then relatively more liberal interpretations of my parents. My mother enjoyed listening to Indian and Pakistani songs on radio when she cleaned the house. This used to irk Abbaji, who often found the lyrics to be lewd and distasteful. According to him, the only acceptable use of a radio was to listen to news, Radio Pakistan News and BBC News Service that came at the turn of every hour. As his eyesight became weaker, I became his eyes and his hands. I mastered the fine art of tuning the radio to receive the hard-to-catch BBC Urdu signal. I also decided to do a bit of research at the Jama'at library and found Ahadith, sayings of the Prophet Muhammad expressing displeasure with music. With Abbaji's approval, I plastered handwritten notes with these ahadith all over our house in Rabwa. I did the same thing at the missionaries' quarters in Karachi in 1979, posting anti-smoking ahadith everywhere. When I heard that my father enjoyed an occasional cigarette when he was alone, he never smoked in front of us. On such occasions, my parents made fun of my overly dogmatic attachment to religion by calling me a Maulvi, that is an Islamic cleric, and an Imam Manja, that is prayer leader of the beds. At other times, when I was not annoying them with my self-righteousness, they asked me to pray for them, because they said God especially listened to my prayers. Somehow, I had acquired the identity of being the most devoted Ahmadi in a family of extremely devoted Ahmadis. Ahmadis believe that a belief in a living God who talks back when people call on him distinguishes them from non-Ahmadi Muslims who believe that God has only communicated with holy personages in the past. Cultivating an active communicative relationship with God is an aspirational goal for all Ahmadis. From my grandfather, I also inherited the sense of a personal relationship with God. Throughout my childhood, I felt that not only was God listening to my prayers, but that he was also actively telling me things by showering me his signs. One of the signs of God's special favor for me was shown to my 8th grade public school teacher, Master Nazir Ahmad Sahab. Just a month or so before our dreaded middle school standards exam, our homeroom teacher at Talimul Islam School called me to the front of the class to tell the whole class about a supernatural experience that he had had in the early hours of that morning in February 1983. He said that as he was walking in the dark from his house to the mosque for morning prayers, he heard a distinct voice saying, "Muhammad Afzal, scholarship." This, he said, was Allah himself foretelling him that not only would I top my competitors in Section A, but that I was destined to score high enough marks to earn the coveted government scholarship in high school. The fact that the prophecy revealed to Master Nazir Sahab came true, and I won top positions in middle school, then high school, and then college, as well as in the religious competitions organized by the community, only reinforced my identity as God's chosen one. Growing up poor on the mean streets of Rabwa without an older brother or a protective father, I found security in the belief that I could always count on Allah. It was comforting to know that there was someone out there who always had my back. I wish I could describe in words the sense of purpose, meaning, and joy that comes from knowing that you have a direct channel of communication with the Creator and all-powerful Lord of the universe. Sometimes late at night, especially when I'm having trouble going to sleep, I think about how I lost that feeling. And I cannot point to any single event, but I think that it all started with the typical teenage rebellion and Abbaji's passing away in 1989, the Ahmadiyya centenary year that he had so longed to see. My grandfather's death was one of many factors, including an opportunity for my mother to take an early retirement with government pension, a decline of Rabwa's status as a Mecca for Ahmadis following Hazur's move from Rabwa to UK in 1984, and general economic malaise in Pakistan, which made moving to the West a trend among Pakistani Ahmadis, that convinced my parents that we should join our father in Canada. As luck would have it, by the time we got our immigration papers and arrived in Saskatoon, Canada, Jamaat had decided to send Abidjan back to Africa, this time to the small West African country of Gambia. This meant that as I arrived in Canada, I had to find my own way in a radically different world. Saskatoon of the early 1990s seemed as different a place from Rabwa as possible. When we arrived there in December 1990, streets were covered with some white powder. Locals called it snow, instead of the brown dirt that littered Rabwa's streets. When the sun came out, the weather got colder and not warmer. People drove on the right side of the road, not on the left side, as they did in Pakistan. People called football soccer, and they called something resembling group wrestling football. Women had shorter hair and wore more revealing clothes than men. Everything seemed upside down. The most bewildering thing was that this opposite world somehow seemed to work better. My father put it best when he said that if the Hadith, cleanliness is half the faith, is to be believed, then clearly Canadians are better Muslims than Pakistanis. Many of the egalitarian ideals that Ahmadis claimed to aspire to, such as justice and equality of the rich and poor, seemed closer to being met in the West than they were ever in Rabwa. Instead of finding any Western converts that I expected to find, given that we were told in Rabwa about the success of Ahmadis missionaries in the West, the only Canadian Ahmadis I met were Pakistani Ahmadis who had immigrated to Canada. Instead of finding droves of non-Ahmadis wanting to convert to Ahmadiyyat, I found Canadians by and large apathetic to the message of Ahmadiyyat and Islam. Instead of finding immorality, injustice, and moral filth in the West, as proclaimed by Ahmadi leaders, as well as by many other Pakistanis, I found the West to be a pretty nice place to live. All of that shook up my worldview and made me question that maybe everything I was told was not as true as I thought that it was. This made me open to the West's liberal narrative that the road to egalitarianism rests on a foundation of constantly questioning authority and not in blindly following it. When I enrolled at the University of Saskatchewan's computer science program, I was required to take social science courses to fulfill my breadth requirements. I chose philosophy and anthropology. I found social science and humanities approach of adopting multiple perspectives quite refreshing. This was opposite to the experience of many of my fellow computer science students who were baffled by the lack of consensus among social scientists on issues of fundamental importance to their disciplines. Afflicted by typical immigrant fears of not finding a job, I could not muster the courage needed to change my major to social sciences. After completing my PhD in computer science, however, I continued my own reading of psychology, anthropology, and philosophy while working as a computer scientist. The more I read about the theory of evolution, the less certain I became of the traditional Islamic explanations for the beginning of life and human existence. Most of the Ahmadis who move to the West do not go through this transition, and I have often wondered why not. Why do people continue to hold blind faith in cult leaders in an era of instant information and social media? I have spent most of my adult life contemplating these questions as well as other questions that my friends and my family ask me. Not a day passes by that my mother, my in-laws, my siblings, or my friends don't ask me as to why I am not as active in the Ahmadiyya community as I used to be during my childhood. Why don't I take a place of honor, distinction, and leadership in the community that my talents and lifetime of achievement would surely bring me. My family and friends genuinely do not understand how I could have so easily given up the blessings of Ahmadiyyat and lost my enthusiasm for true Islam. My scientific colleagues, on the other hand, do not understand how and why any rational person could believe in cultish ideas such as those proclaimed by the founder of the Ahmadiyya community and held in such high esteem by most of my family and friends. Only simpletons can be brainwashed by cult leaders into blindly following them, argue my scientific colleagues. This book is both a deeply personal account of my struggle to find answers to these puzzling questions and a scientific account of why new religious movement founders come up with their counterintuitive ideas and why others accept them and join new religious movements.